to begin, I wonder if you might tell us, why did you want to become dean?
I wanted to become dean because I was very concerned about schools of education in the United States, and the major universities were getting rid of them. Harvard was thinking of getting rid of its. And I thought that if Harvard, which takes itself quite seriously as an eminent university, if it got rid of its school of education, that would be very bad for the study of education and the improvement of education in the United States. And so when President Derek Bok came to see me, I was in Washington as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center at the Smithsonian. He came to see me to ask me to become dean. I said, took me to lunch. He forgot his wallet, so I paid for the lunch, and then he reimbursed me subsequently. Okay. So we got off to a good start. And I said that I would be very happy to become dean if he would be willing to revisit the policy of not offering tenure to faculty at the ed school.
Yeah, so could you give a little more background on this? I don't think many people know this history.
Well, 3 of us got tenure at the ed school in 1974. Charles Willey, Robert Levine, and me. The 3 of us are an unlikely trio. And after that, I hope this was not causation, but after that, nobody got tenure. And so when he asked me to become dean in the fall of 1981, and ultimately I agreed, I said, I will only do this if you give me your word that you will revisit the tenure issue after I have had a little time to be there as dean. And he said he would. And I said, all I have is your word. But his word was good. And that was true not only in the tenure issue, but in other dealings with him as well. And it was sort of in the air that prestigious universities were getting rid of their schools of education. Duke, Yale, Chicago, right. Stanford came within a whisker, and Berkeley nearly got rid of its. So right after I became dean, Derek Bok conferred with his pal, who was the president of Stanford, Don Kennedy, and they convened a conference of presidents and deans of schools of education, the ones that were still left, of about 6 or 8 universities. And we met and talked about whether major research universities ought to include schools of education. The argument was that schools of education aren't serious, they don't do good work, they're not academically eminent. Let somebody else do that. That was the argument against them. The argument for them was that if you want to have a society in which everybody is well educated, you need to figure out how to do that. And research universities have, generally speaking, had not been as interested in the problems of the poor, who are a very big group who are not well educated. They thought that was not their problem. They could have second-rate people take care of that. And my point, and Derek Bok's point, and Don Kennedy's point, was everybody in the society needs to be well educated, and we need the best minds we can find to help do that. But when we then were able to, the big decision to resume tenure appointments, then I saw Derek, and I explained what the rationale was between the different appointments that we wanted to make, and why I thought this was an appropriate rationale, and why I thought these people should be appointed.
Well, kudos, and thank you so much, because advocating for the school and making those appointments was so important in our history. You were actually able to secure 9 new tenured appointments.
They're great people.
Well, could you mention just a few that you recruited and were able to bring to the faculty?
The first person we recruited to tenure was Kurt Fisher. And Kurt was a person whom the world believed was a very solid citizen. And he was not internal to the ed school. And it seemed very important that the first person we bring on would not be one of our own. The second person was Howard Gardner, who, of course, was and is, fortunately, one of our
Definitely.
own. Carol Gilligan, who was one of our own. Catherine Snow, who is one of our own. And as we went down the line, Eleanor Duckworth in the teaching and learning, which was an ill-defined area at the school. And she was doing work that was very different from anybody else. She actually worked with school teachers, and which was a novelty.
Oh, yes.
And then in the third area, administration, planning, and social policy, that was a little of this and a little of that. That's where I was. That was Jerry Murphy, and then Gary Orfield, and Richard Elmore. And then we also hired, before the tenure rule went through, Carol Weiss and Patricia Cross.
Okay.
But the first one, of course, was Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot.
Yes.
And that was what broke open the tenure rules. And we couldn't have started with anyone better than that.
So what was some of the most intriguing scholarship that was coming out of HGSE at the time?
Howard's Gardner's book, Frames of Mind, which talked about the many intelligences, was not a brand new idea, but certainly for most people who were not immersed in the history of education and British psychologists, it was brand new. And it certainly violated contemporary opinion about education. And so that we were very fortunate that came out just as Howard was getting tenure, because Howard had not been an assistant professor and associate professor. He'd been a research associate. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's work about different schools was very important, but I think probably what Sarah's work that was most gripping when it came out was the biography of her mother, who still lives, yes, believe it or not. And her mother was the first Black woman to be at the Columbia Medical School. It was a psychiatrist, was a practicing psychiatrist. In fact, some friends of ours, when we lived in New York, had her as a psychiatrist, and I heard about her mother before I met Sarah, and knew her father, who I was on the board with for a journal. So it's a remarkable family. Chris Argyris's work on organizations was extremely interesting. Jerry Murphy's work on how the Elementary and Secondary Education Act got passed, 1965, the first real federal aid to education, of which he had been a worker in Washington on the staff of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Johnson administration when that passed. That work. The person who taught really interesting classes, but who hadn't written much, was David Cohen. Oh. And of course, today we think of David Cohen as this writer who has written so much, but David wrote that after he left Harvard. But he taught that much of that while he was at Harvard, for which we were very fortunate. Catherine Snow's work on language development and on reading was profound. The person who was probably one of the best-known members of the faculty then was Carol Gilligan, who was giving women's issues an attention that nobody else had had in a series of essays. Bob Selman was in a group that was doing counseling psychology, and his subsequent work moved him into looking at the lives of adolescents in very important ways. And I could go on and on.
So when you reflect back, what is the thing you're most proud of?
Oh, goodness. I hadn't thought of that. I'm pleased with the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I'm pleased that it's now considered appropriate to think about poor children's education, particularly poor children of color. I started out teaching poor white children, because I was in a segregated school system and I'm white. And poor children have tremendous disadvantages in this society, and education is one of the main ones. Their families are often wonderful, but the formal schooling that these children have is often lamentable. And if we can try to work on that, that seems to me very important.